By the way, there are quite a few quizzes and even a few exams that haven't been picked up over the weeks, and they've just kind of been accumulating on the stand that's beside my office door. But I brought them in today just in case you want to go through the papers that are on that chair on your way out. So if you, for example, skipped a class after a quiz, then maybe you wouldn't have picked up your quiz that day. And so all those loose assignments that haven't been collected and quizzes and so on are right over there on the chair. Your last homework assignment is due on Wednesday. It's related to depreciation, so it includes straight line, declining balance, and then also the subject of today's class, MACRS. And I'm not sure if that abbreviation is defined in the notes that I'm going to be showing you today. So it stands for Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System. I'll tell you what it is, but that's what the acronym stands for. All right. Any questions before we get into it? All right. So Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System is a depreciation method that blends the two approaches that were discussed in the video. So the video I showed you for Friday's class had straight line and declining balance. And straight line is just like the name implies, it's a linear depreciation system where the amount each year is constant. Declining balance was where you assume that equipment loses more value early on because that's when the equipment itself is more valuable. Here, this blend of both says that we always depreciate to zero, which is something that declining balance didn't do. Remember, the declining balance depreciation, it was depreciating quite a lot at first, but then it kind of leveled out and it never lost all of its value. So here in Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System, it never considers a salvage value, and it switches from double declining balance. That's what DDB stands for, double declining balance. And so in that percentage formula that was shown in the video, and it's in your notes, for double declining balance, you'd assume that the percentage is 200. So that means in the first year, you're losing 200% of what straight line depreciation would predict. But then it switches over, this Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System switches over to straight line depreciation so that it can go to zero. Otherwise, it would never make the salvage value go all the way down. So it kind of is the best of both worlds. Businesses want to have as much depreciation as quickly as possible for two reasons. Because number one, it's always better to get money now rather than later. And that's especially made true because money these days dollars now are more valuable than future dollars. So if you're only going to be getting a certain amount of depreciation over the item's entire useful life, those dollars are more valuable sooner rather than later because of the effect of the time value of money. Now, in this method, what we do is we look up off of classification systems to know what recovery period the equipment should use. It's not information you get from the manufacturer. It's not something that you assume. It's actually kind of a legal description and a classification system where equipment is put into certain categories, and everything in that category depreciates for a certain amount of time regardless of how long it'll actually last. Now, the strangest thing about this depreciation method is the time convention. What we assume is called the half-year convention, and because companies were abusing the system, the government had to put a rule into place that would prevent them from taking too much depreciation early on. And let me tell you what their trick was. Let's say a business knew that they needed a piece of equipment, and it was going to have to be purchased sometime in the next year or so. What they'd sometimes do is they'd buy it on the last day of the year or the last week of the year. The point is that they'd buy it really close to the end of the tax season, and then they'd use the entire year's depreciation for the year in question, even though they'd only owned the item for a very short period of time within that period. And so what the government did was say that in the first year that you own the equipment, you can only take a half share of depreciation that year, and it kind of reduces the incentive for companies to be gaming the system. So there's less of an incentive to buy an item at the end of the year and then try and take a full year's depreciation. Now you can still buy it at the end of the year, but you can only take half a share of depreciation during that first period. And so that half-year convention is built into the table that I'm going to show you today, but that's the reason why the first factor that you'll see in each column is lower than the second factor that you'll see. Okay, so this is how you find out the recovery period. The class life, this column, class life for each different type of equipment. You can think of class life as how long they expect the equipment on average to actually last when it's put into service. And so that's its estimated life. But then recovery period, and there's two different types of recovery period. GDS is General Depreciation System. ADS is Alternative Depreciation System. These are how many years you can take the depreciation over. Now sometimes the difference between class life and recovery period is because the class life was an even number of years. And one of the strange things about this modified accelerated cost recovery system is that all of the recovery periods are an odd number of years. And so, for instance, heavy general purpose trucks, they expect to last for 6 years, but since 6 isn't one of the options, they round it down to 5 years, just so it's that odd number of years that they have the factors for. But in some cases, it was odd to begin with. If you see buses are expected to last for 9 years, but the government allows, under the GDS system, it allows the depreciation to be taken over 5. So what that is it's a concession to people who are operating buses to try and allow them to take accelerated depreciation. So they're doing them a favor, in other words. The government is allowing a bus company, whether it's municipal buses or for-profit buses that are maybe used for churches or like Greyhound and so on. They're allowing them to take more of the depreciation sooner. And so anytime you see that it's been rounded down, you can think of it as a tax loophole or special interest. You know, whoever's lobbying the government on the behalf of companies that manufacture wood products got a special concession, and they're able to take their depreciation over a smaller number of years. In rare instances, the GDS period is greater than the class life. And that doesn't happen very often, but sometimes, for instance, they're rounding up light general purpose trucks. That went from 4 to 5, probably just because it was the even going to an odd type thing. But then here in the cases of automobiles, the class life is 3, but the recovery period is 5. And so it's tough to know exactly all the wheeling and dealing that went into that decision, other than the government has to receive a certain amount of revenue, and if they're extra favorable to one industry, then they have to be relatively less favorable to another. So in any case, the thing that you need to remember is that equipment falls into a certain category, and then based on that category, you'll get the number of years from this table. Once you have the number of years, you go to the secondary table and you find which row applies. So if it's going to be that you're doing a problem related to a light general purpose truck, 5 years GDS, so we find the 5-year column. So something that lasts for 5 years, how many depreciation factors do you count there? Excluding the zeros at the end. I'm not sure why they put those in, but there's 6. So it says that it's 5-year depreciation, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I've already kind of explained the clue to you, but why do you suppose that there are 6 factors here if they're saying it's a 5-year useful life? Half-year convention. Yeah, so if you look, this system is that you're only getting 0.2, so 20% of the depreciation occurs in the first year, because they're assuming you bought it halfway through the year. So what they do is they only give you a half share that compared to what you ordinarily would have got if they didn't use the half-year convention. So, and remember, this is double declining balance, right? So they're assuming 20% in the first year, then in the second year, you're taking 32% of the overall value is depreciated, and then this last year is a much smaller share. So remember, what it's doing is it's, roughly speaking, it's transitioning from the double declining balance to the straight line method, but then it always goes to 0. And so, I mean, it's approximating a curve and a line, but it's not exactly a curve and a line because they need, the sum total of these always has to equal 1. If you add up all of these factors, for each column, the sum of those factors is going to be equal to 1 because you have 100% of the value of the item is depreciating over its useful life. So this is actually quite a lot easier than straight line and especially easier than declining balance because all you need to do is if you know what was the original book value of a certain item, you know, how much did it cost to purchase, to have shipped, the training, you know, the entire installation and bringing it online cost, you multiply that total amount by each one of these factors and that tells you the depreciation amount for that year. Now this is the method that's kind of taken over for tax purposes in the United States. And it's a transition from the straight line to double declining balance. And the reason why they allowed this method to take hold is it was kind of conceived as an economic stimulus, a way of giving manufacturers an incentive to buy new equipment. Because the more you allow them to write off the cost of equipment, you're kind of encouraging business to buy new machinery, to invest in faster machinery for like producing more, and they were trying to stimulate economic growth, and so that was the original justification for it. And here's the in-class exercise we're going to get some practice on. You can use Excel for this if you like. You can also do it quite easily by hand. But what we're saying is that we have a bus, and what we want to do is find out how much depreciation can be taken for each of the following years. So we're using the GDS method. So calculate the depreciation amount and the book value for each year. Remember, book value, if we take a look at the formula, the book value for each year is the cost basis minus the cumulative depreciation for all the years up until the year that you're in. So we want to know not just the depreciation amount for each year, but what's the book value. And book value is different from the actual market value of an item. The book value is just kind of an accounting technique. It's, you know, on paper, what is the thing worth in the eyes of the government? Or another way of looking at it is, how much depreciation do you still have left in a piece of equipment? So it can be completely independent from what you'd be able to sell the item for on the secondary market. Sometimes the two are related, but book value is really something separate. Okay, I got a good question, and I'm going to pause you on what you're working on and just let everybody know. If you look at the formula for the depreciation amount for any given year, it's the depreciation factor for that year, but you're always multiplying it by the first cost basis. And so, for example, the depreciation in year 2, doesn't depend on the book value from year one. It depends on the original, in this case, on what we're working on, 238,000. So 238,000 is B, the first cost. So all of your depreciation amounts are based on that. All right, so just to review the solution strategy here, in the problem statement it says that it is bus. So with bus we go to 7.2, and that category of equipment will depreciate over 5 years. So then we go to table 7.3 and we find the 5-year column, because these are the factors that are going to be used to calculate the depreciation amount. And the depreciation amount for each year, capital D, is simply going to be the depreciation factor, lowercase d, multiplied by the cost basis. And by the way, when you're typing in these depreciation amounts, it's always a good idea to highlight the entire range and then look down here at the statistics where it says average, count, sum. What I want to make sure is that the sum is 1. Because if the sum isn't 1, that means that I've keyed something in incorrectly. So the sum of those depreciation factors will always be 1, meaning that over the course of its entire class life, it's depreciating the full value, the initial cost basis. All right, so then book value for year 1, at the end of the first year, the book value is the cost basis minus the depreciation amount for that year. For the second year, though, it's based on the previous year's book value. Or the other way of looking at it, the way that the formula said in the PowerPoint slide, the formula says it's the cost basis minus the sum of the depreciation up to that point. So another way to calculate this $114,240 would be the cost basis of $238,000 minus both of the depreciation amounts that have occurred to date, meaning the first year's amount and the second year's amount. So then that just continues downward. That trend is always going to be the previous book year minus the depreciation amount for this row, and eventually we get to 0, and that tells us everything worked out just fine. It won't go exactly to 0, though, if you're rounding off your calculations. Like if you're rounding off to the nearest dollar, then it could be a couple of dollars off at the end, or it certainly would be off if you're not using these full depreciation factors. All right, what does MACRS stand for? Yeah, good, good. It sounds like a room full of zombies. Modified, accelerated. All right. Let's just review the announcements here. I guess you've really only got one other thing besides the final exam that's still on your schedule. That homework 16, depreciation, is due on Wednesday. We're going to talk about the final exam probably Wednesday or Friday. I'll give you some more additional information. Huh? The exam itself? I don't know. It's on the course schedule. Anybody got the course schedule handy? Friday? All right. I'll see you Wednesday. Have a good day.